Doha Forum has been described, indeed by a Qatari themselves, as the legendary Rick's Cafe in the film Casablanca. That is, everybody is allowed in as long as they play by the rules of the cafe. I'm Charlotte Leslie and I'm the Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, speaking to you from the Doha Forum. The Doha Forum is indeed a real bubble burster for anyone coming here from the West. There are people from all over the world, high representation from the Global South, discussing issues from very different perspectives to those we hear in our daily lives in the Westminster bubble or further abroad. In this podcast, I'll be speaking to just a small selection of the people who are here to try to navigate the extraordinary, turbulent events that have taken place in just the last week at the time of recording. I'm here with Nicholas Hopton. Nicholas, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Charlotte. My name is Nicholas Hopton. I'm a former diplomat for 35 years, and I served as ambassador in Yemen, in Qatar, in Iran, and in Libya. Since leaving the diplomatic service, I have been leading the Middle East Association.
And what does the Middle East Association do? There are a lot of Middle East-related outfits in the UK. What makes the MEA different?
The MEA is seeking to strengthen UK relations with the countries of Middle East, North Africa and the region as a whole, which is extremely important to us on so many different levels. Convene, we facilitate, we join dots, we're operating at a fairly strategic level, quite high level, trying to do things that other people aren't doing already and fill the space between government, business, universities, academics, think tanks, politicians, and anyone else who's interested in seeing UK-MENA relations prosper.
So we're here at the Doha Forum after, by any measure, what can be described as a fairly turbulent week in the region. What are your key takeaways from the forum so far? What are you hearing? And what do you think the implications of very, very recent events are for the region?
Sometimes meetings like the Doha Forum are serendipitous in their timing. Momentous events where the forum is an ideal place to analyse and discuss them are happening simultaneous to a gathering of people who spend their lives looking at and analysing and trying to advise on a particular question. Now that is what's happening here in Doha this weekend. It has been well attended, very high-level attendees, and having been convened by the Qataris under the leadership of His Highness Sheikh Tamim, fresh from his state visit to London, which seems to have been a great success for the bilateral and wider relationships. The Doha Forum has managed to bring together some very high-level participants, including the First Lady of the US, outgoing Jill Biden, and appearances by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, the Turkish Foreign Minister, and possibly the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi will also talk this afternoon to delegates. So the timing has been impressive. The location is ideal, being in a country which is playing a central mediating role in the region and more widely on geopolitical crises. And we've been able to have a space in which people who have been watching the region for a very long time and have a degree of expertise are able to exchange views and try and work out what are the possible scenarios for future developments given what is unfolding in Syria this week and last week the ceasefire brokered in Lebanon. All of this, of course, against the backdrop of an incoming new US president. And my main takeaways from the conversations I've been having in Doha and from what I've heard from some of those ministers and leaders who have addressed the Doha Forum, my main takeaways include a series of thoughts, and I'll break them down. First of all, I think the breakthrough in Lebanon last week was significant because it demonstrated that the terrible conflict that has been ongoing since the atrocities, the terrorist acts of 7 October 2023, that cycle of violence, which seemed just a few weeks ago without a way out of the tunnel, and destined to just escalate and involve even more needless innocent civilian deaths and a wider growing fragility and uncertainty in the region. The Lebanese ceasefire provided a degree of hope that a way might be found to stabilise the situation, to also build on that and move towards a ceasefire as soon as possible in Gaza, and a political process leading to a two-state solution, a sovereign state for the Palestinians, which seems to be the only sustainable, viable route to bring stability for all those who live in the region. That Lebanese ceasefire certainly provided hope that progress might be made and that we could see an end to killing and needless escalation sooner rather than later. Now, on top of that, the fragility of that ceasefire cannot be overstated because, of course, the fundamental problems remain, and also the likelihood of a ceasefire in Gaza still seems slim, given the fundamental impasse in day-after scenario planning, which the main parties in that conflict differ on very fundamentally. But I think what has happened in Syria and unfolded over the last week, it must be said, to the surprise of many at this forum who did not see this coming, including implicitly yesterday admitted by Sergei Lavrov that the Russians didn't see this coming either, that their key ally, Bashar al-Assad, would be not only suffering setbacks in his dictatorship and control over large parts of the country, but would actually be driven out, as has happened in the last 24 hours, and that he has now gone into exile. So that development has forced analysts and others to step back and to think, actually, what are the implications of this major upheaval in the way the region has been configured for a decade? Now, one of the areas which I think requires very close attention is how Iran will react to the loss of their ally Bashar al-Assad, a historical ally. Syria, under his father and then under Bashar al-Assad himself, has been allied closely with the regime, the Islamic Republic, since the 1979 revolution. Almost uniquely, in fact, during the war that Iran fought against Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And I think Iran will be wondering, given their ongoing conflict with Israel, which has seen unprecedented direct exchanges between the two countries this year, Iran will be wondering, in the regime at least, will be wondering what should be their next step. It is notable that they have not fought particularly hard to preserve the regime of Bashar al-Assad as the opposition forces advanced. They have not made clear their position, but in the meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia, Turkey and Iran yesterday, the three foreign powers most involved in supporting the two sides, it seems to have been an understanding that the outcome of this insurgency by the opposition forces, which has now led, I understand, to Damascus no longer being under the control of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian army, that this outcome should not be resisted through excessive military force, even though, of course, Russia has lent air power and firepower to the Syrian army resisting the opposition over the last days, but that this new reality needs dealing with in a new way. Now, what that means has yet to be seen. So that puts Iran in a challenging position because, of course, Syria is a part of its not only axis of fundamental allies, but the Islamic Republic also has relied on Syria as part of its route to supply Lebanese Hezbollah. And Lebanese Hezbollah, of course, a party to the Lebanese ceasefire agreement last week. They're still in existence, but they need to, if they are to survive, they need resupply and building up in the eyes of Iran. How to do that now that Syria has been perhaps fundamentally removed from an access point for resupply is a new challenge for Tehran. I think the role played by Turkey in all this is extremely important. The statements by Western governments, the United States, UK and our allies, calling for dialogue and negotiation And the voices here at the forum of many looking to see a political process which allows for a Syrian-led and a Syrian inclusive of all voices to forge a new settlement for Syria in due course, whatever that may be, but in the interest essentially of the Syrian people. That has been a common call at this Doha Forum. So things are moving fast. We are in a different geographical dynamic from a fortnight ago, certainly, right across the Levant. And that wider change also has implications for the conflict between Iran and Israel, for the situation in Gaza potentially, and for a geographical positioning by major powers such as Russia, Turkey, and of course the Western powers, in particular the United States, which is about to welcome a new US President, Donald Trump.
We are here at the Doha Forum surrounded by a multitude of different people at different levels from different nations from across the world. What role can the UK, which is now neither part of Europe politically and does not have the might of the US, what role can the UK play?
The UK has ability to convene parties in a conflict such as the situation in Syria or the situation in Lebanon and elsewhere in the region. The UK has a unique ability to bring together parties and try and, through diplomacy and dialogue, create space and opportunity for progress and political settlement. This is part of our brand. This is what we have done repeatedly, including in recent years since the so-called Arab Spring. We were effective following the fall of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Syria in helping forge a unique alliance between a group of 10 countries, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and the GCC countries, to develop a plan and a process for the settlement and future progress of Yemen. That didn't succeed, but the British government played a fundamental part in moving that forward for several years before other events caused it to be paused. And I think we also have played a similar role in other countries at various times in other crises. So without wishing to overstate it, because of course it requires strong political will and leadership from the British government, working in partnership closely with our allies, particularly the US, France, other European partners. But without wishing to overstate it, there is a potential role for the United Kingdom to be helpful, to be supportive, and in particular when looking at what's going on in Syria at the moment, or even Lebanon, to be engaged in a more active way perhaps than we have been able to until recently, and to prioritise a democratic dialogue which leads to outcomes which benefit the people of those countries, which are led by those people from Lebanon, from Syria, and lead to a more stable, peaceful and prosperous Middle East in the future.
Nicholas Hopton, Director General of the Middle East Association and former diplomat, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Hello, Victoria. Can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hello, it's Victoria Prentis, former Attorney General and former MP for Banbury, currently a speaker at the Doha Forum where it's fabulous weather.
And you've been invited to the Doha Forum to speak. Can I ask you what you're going to be speaking about?
Yes, I'm on a panel and we're considering whether international law works. So we're talking about the ICC and the ICJ and their jurisdiction and changes in the world around us and how law reacts to those changes.
We have an enormous number of people here from all sorts of parts of the world. Someone described Doha Forum as Rick's Cafe, where as long as you obey the rules of the cafe, that's fine and anyone's invited. What different perspectives and viewpoints on rule of law are you hearing from the forum?
Well, quite major ones, really. This is one of the reasons I'm enjoying the forum. We're exposed to a whole group of nations and people that we don't otherwise run into in our normal European bubble. And it's good to hear other people's perspectives. The rule of law is defined really in our world, in Britain, as the fact that nobody is above the law and the state is not above the law either, and that everybody is equal before the law. I am getting quite different perspectives from some of the nations here. Probably the most extreme difference is that with the Chinese, who talk about the rule of law very frequently and have done for many, many thousands of years in their existence. But for them, it means not only the fact that law is important, but it also means allegiance to one party, which is really the antithesis of what it means to us.
We heard Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov yesterday speaking, which was fascinating. I was very struck by how often he appealed to rule of law. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what that might mean for a Russian foreign minister following the illegal invasion of Ukraine under what most of us would describe as any kind of rule of law. Have you had any insight on that kind of perspective?
I found it quite difficult to understand, actually. I am very involved at the moment in training Ukrainian lawyers to understand international law and to help them get ready to prosecute war crimes in their war, whichever side commits them. They're very fair-minded and committed to what I would describe as the rule of law. I'm afraid I don't get that message from the Russian state, not least because self-determination is pretty central to what we feel makes a state in our definition of the rule of law. And that's clearly not what's going on in Ukraine, which was invaded.
One of the other themes that's emerged quite strongly is a perception, whether justified or not, that the West, the creator of the world order post the Second World War, applies double standards in its application of it. And that, of course, is born out of the perceived difference in our response to the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and then Israel's reaction to the Hamas terror attacks on October the 7th. Do you think there's a real danger of the West losing credibility over its authority on rule of law and human rights? And if so, what can we do about it while still standing up for allies and our values?
I think this is something we need to take seriously. For many years, the ICC, for example, was accused by its detractors of focusing on African crimes to the exclusion of other crimes around the world. We've seen, with its actions recently on Russian leaders and on Israeli and Hamas leaders, that that's simply not the case. We need to, whatever you may think of those arrest warrants, they're clearly not African leaders who are being targeted. We need to be careful in the way that we present the rule of law to the world to make sure that the differences between our definition and, for example, the Chinese are clear for all to see. I think we, particularly in Britain perhaps, don't realise the extent to which our lawyers are held in high esteem around the world, and that we simply take for granted things like the independence of the judiciary, which other states do not. And I think we come to this conversation with a lot of goodwill from neutral states, not least because the way that the common law world works is very, very close to ours, and people are familiar with our system and respect it broadly. We have a large number of international lawyers who appear before international tribunals all over the world and are very, very well respected as well. So I think we need perhaps to consolidate this work and to make sure that the export of our version of the rule of law becomes something that we take very, very seriously in Britain. I see some signs of that in the work that the Foreign Office is doing, and to a certain extent that the MOJ is doing. But I really think that if we believe, as I believe, that our version of the rule of law will help the world solve its undoubted problems at the moment, that we've got to talk about this, and we've got to be quite bold in the way that we do that.
Finally, coming back home, and I'm going to ask you this because of your legal background, as we record, there's a domestic debate about ethics and standards of some of our lawyers and law firms in the UK, the role of the Solicitors Regulation Authority. Again, do you think there's any risk of complacency and slipping of standards domestically at home? Is it important to maintain these standards? And if the UK's USP, if you like, is fairness, should we be doing more to capitalise on that?
Yes, I think it's very important that we maintain our high standards. I think we do that. And I think we're a very good and fair-minded system on the whole. And when people transgress those standards, and I've had experience of that with opponents in my own practice, the Solicitors Regulation Authority is quick to step in and censure them, as it did with Phil Shiner, for example. So I think that our system on the whole works well. I think we're horrified when people don't behave properly and to the highest ethical standards. Yes, I do think this is something we should major on. We are really lucky in that we do, I think, take those standards and the regulatory authorities for granted. I think we forget how brilliant the independence of the judiciary really is. I cannot remember when I have had a conversation with somebody about a judge being party pre or bent in some way. In the UK, we might well have a conversation about the type of judge we've got and how they've decided previous cases, but there's never been any question in my mind but that our judiciary were completely fair-minded. And I think that's something to be very, very proud of.
Victoria Prentis, thank you very much indeed.
Hello, I'm Chris Doyle. I'm the Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. I am an Arabic graduate and have travelled across the region, but my specialist areas would be particularly in the Levant, in Lebanon, Syria and Palestine.
We're here at the Doha Forum at a particularly turbulent and active time for Levant and particularly Syria. We learnt just today as we record that Assad had fled Damascus. Can I ask you, what does this mean for Syria? And can you first run us through, because it's complicated, who are the opposing forces to Assad?
It's an extraordinary day for Syria, for Syrians. It's a day many people had long given up they would ever see in their lifetimes. So to see, it's not just that it's happened, that Assad is no longer in power, and that's for certain. It's also the way it's happened. This started on the 27th of November, this phase, and to see Syrian cities fall one after the other, the prisons, the regime's prisons, chock-a-block full of people, some who didn't even know that Bashar al-Assad was in power. They'd been in there that long, holed up. So there's these extraordinary tsunami of emotions for Syrians, of joy, yes, that this regime that has ruled over them, that has bled the country dry for 53 years, this one family is gone, very, very, very unlikely ever to return to power. But also, as they celebrate, as they mark this, yes, there is some nervousness about the way forward. But I think today is the moment where they actually can experience a little bit of joy for once after, let's not forget, so many years of suffering, the uprising that began in 2011 that transformed into a civil war, a crisis, an economic crisis that shattered the country. There's no cake left to fight over, so it's a bitter, sweet moment, of course. Syrians are remembering their loved ones who were lost in this conflict. Was it all worth it? What was it all for? Why did the regime fight tooth and nail all those years to survive, and then now, in these last 11 days, fell so easy like a pack of cards? But that matters. The fact that the regime fell so quickly, that it folded, meant actually that there was no popular support. Not one single component of Syrian society was prepared to stand with Assad. There was no real fighting here. City after city just collapsed, and the regime had lost any credibility with its support base. They realized that there was no peace dividend after 5 or 6 years of the front lines having largely been frozen. The economy had stagnated. The regime had utterly failed to do anything to improve lives for Syrians. It refused to talk to Turkey, to talk to Kurdish groups. It was arrogant in its approach, and of course, much of the responsibility for that lay with Bashar al-Assad and his immediate entourage. In terms of, what were called the opposition and may now become part of some future political power play within Syria, it's myriad. A lot of people have focused on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, this was a group that was originally Jabhat al-Nusra, that was the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda. It is originally a Salafist Islamist group. It has been ruling much of the province of Idlib in the northwest of Syria, authoritarian. They have their own prisons. They have done a rebranding exercise. They have changed their language. They have, in capturing and taking Syrian cities like Aleppo, reached out to other communities, because Syria is a country of many different groups and identities, and promised them and did deals to say, we will not go after you, whether you are Alawis, Ismailis, Druze, Christians. That was very important. But I know that a lot of people are asking, is this a real change or is it just temporary? This is one of the big questions. But one mustn't exaggerate their role. They're not the only actor, far from it. There was also the Syrian National Army. This is a Turkish-backed force found in the northern part of Syria that sort of grew out of groups like the Free Syria Army, more secular, obviously with a lot of influence from Ankara as well, the supplies. That also applies to an extent to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But they also formed a key body. But you also have to remember that in the south of Syria, these groups didn't really exist, weren't key players. And also in the east, where you have Kurdish-led forces, Syrian Democratic Front, were power players there. So there's not necessarily one clear dominant faction. What matters now is that there is a process through which Syrians can get round the table in their myriad components, that there isn't one dominant faction, one dominant individual that is appointed, but a process that will rise to the top and lead to some sort of political power sharing. Obviously, eventually, in due time, one would hope some form of elections to give legitimacy to whoever rules Syria, but that should not be rushed. It's going to be very tough. One, I think, very positive piece of news is that the state, as opposed to the regime, has not collapsed. The Syrian Prime Minister remains in post. That is not being contested. It means that services will continue. We're not going to have that Iraq model where everything was stripped, the de-Baathification, and that matters. You still need the schools to work, the hospitals to work, the transport systems to work. There is a lot of, work to be done to clear the streets, even of military paraphernalia. Syrians are learning how to drive tanks, to get them off the roads, but to really also to kickstart the economy. And this, of course, is where the international community has to come in. We have to be careful that in whatever aid or support we give, that it's done sensibly. Be careful of giving too much too fast until the right systems are in place. There isn't a cake to fight over at the moment, but maybe there will be if there's some huge Syria fund, and that could attract all sorts of tensions. It also needs to be make sure that all the money is not focused towards Damascus. It's decentralized to all the regions, that all Syrians see some sort of stake in economic growth and moving forward out of an horrific level of poverty and suffering that they have. But that is in the future, and I think at the moment one has to look at the optimism of all of this and what it might also mean for the region. If Syria does find a way forward, and it will be difficult, there will be tough moments, it will send out messages to the region. I think countries like Iran have certainly had their wings clipped. I think that's significant. I think they will be nervous domestically as well as what it means for them. But also it sends a message, I think, that you cannot ignore the wishes and the aspirations of your peoples. And that is one that I think many governments would be wise to watch. Things can change very quickly. You can lose legitimacy. You can lose power.
What do you think this may mean for neighbouring countries like Lebanon and Turkey, who have taken on huge numbers of Syrian refugees, and Jordan, of course? Is the optimism and the hope going to spill over those borders?
Already we're seeing Syrians just getting into cars and leaving Turkey, leaving Lebanon to go back, hopefully to their homes if they are still standing or they haven't been taken over by some regime crony. There's going to be a huge issue about property ownership. Records were destroyed and those close to the regime took over huge swathes of real estate and property. So those are struggles. But yeah, Syrians want to go back. They want to see their country again. They lived in a situation they weren't sure they'd ever go back. So of course they're going to do that. And I think we'll see even Syrians in Europe look at the options for doing this as well, to go back on visits. They want to reconnect with the country, with their family, with their friends, to go and see the cities that they grew up in and they worked in and they lived. So, that matters. Of course, for those countries, and let's remember this, the neighbouring countries who hosted nearly all the refugees, they will be, happy to see large numbers of refugees, going back, not just for them, that they might be happy for them, but also it has been a burden on them. Lebanon has its own crises that it's had to deal with, even before the recent Israeli invasion, the Beirut port explosion, the economic crisis in Lebanon. So actually it's been a burden on the state. Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan have all been extremely hospitable, but it has tested community relations. It has strained it. And as much as they were hospitable, there was a limit. So I think those governments will hope to see a safe return of those refugees, and let's hope it is safe, because it will allow them, relieve them of what has become a burden. And bearing in mind that many of the appeals for funding from donor states had been falling way, way short as money was diverted to other conflicts, which perhaps was in the media more often. People have forgotten about Syria, were thinking about Syria. So it's gone to Sudan, to Palestine, Ukraine. Now there has to be a real realignment of where international aid funding goes to now and how much might be available for Syria in a reconstruction, reconciliation. And I think I'll finish on that to say that, the buildings can go back up again, but actually healing the country, the scars, the mental trauma of all of this, to actually rebuild a society that has been ripped apart is going to be perhaps the biggest long-term challenge. This is a people who have endured quite unimaginable suffering, and it will take time.
Chris Doyle, Council for Arab-British Understanding, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
My name is Amr Al-Azm. I'm a professor of Middle East history and anthropology at Shawnee State University in Ohio.
As we speak here in the foyer of the Sheraton Hotel at the Doha Forum, news has come in this morning that Assad has fled Damascus and it has fallen to rebels. What's your reaction to that news?
Obviously I'm elated, like everyone else who's Syrian and who's wanted to see the end to the Assad regime and a change, a democratic transition in Syria. Of course, we remain hopeful, but these are difficult times, and transitions are always turbulent as well, but we can only hope for the best.
We talk about the rebels and opposition forces. Can you give us a beginner's guide to anyone who isn't very involved in Syrian politics, what those rebel forces and opposition forces are comprised of? Because there's quite different groups involved, aren't there?
Right. Well, maybe I should just correct the terminology a little. When you use the term rebels, which obviously you're not intending in a negative way, but I think it's the Syrian people. I prefer to think that this has always been about the Syrian people wanting to make a change. Ever since 2011 with the Arab Spring, when it finally arrived to Syria in March 2011. And we've been struggling each in our own way, some fighting and dying, others active as civil society, part of civil society movements. But the Syrian people pretty much have participated in one way or another throughout this conflict. And I feel that we can only now get to the next level by continuing to work and find means and ways of just finding the common ground that we can talk again. I mean, let me just, if you allow me just to backtrack, think about this. Syria as a country, with the start of the war in 2011, essentially ruptured across every possible cleavage. Social, sectarian, religious, ethnic, rich and poor, north and south, tribal, non-tribal. Any cleavage you can think in that society that essentially made up what a Syrian is a Syrian, what makes a Syrian, essentially ruptured and disintegrated right there and then. And we've always thought, even back then, that at some point we would need to find a way, Syrians would need to find a way to come back again and talk to each other. How are we going to do that? And as the war went on and as the bloodletting got worse and worse and as the atrocities mounted, the people from the north had almost nothing in common with the people from the south. The people from the east had almost nothing in common from the west. And that was a big concern for us. And that's the challenge we face today. Finding those common denominators. What is it that's going to bring these people back? What's the glue that held that society once upon a time disintegrated? So now, what is it? Where's it going to come from? And for me, as an archaeologist, I look to our shared common history. It's the part, because every Syrian knows who Queen Zenobia is. It doesn't matter where you come from in Syria. Every Syrian will know who Queen Zenobia is. She's the Queen of Palmyra in the east. Every Syrian knows that the first alphabet came from Ugarit in the north, on the coast. Okay, and it doesn't matter whether you're from that part or you're from the south. Every Syrian knows that, the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate was Damascus. So, and I can go on and on and on and on describing these. So it's going to be those common denominators that still every Syrian recognizes. They're going to start that communication process. And where else and where best to start this healing process and communication process except in somewhere like, for example, the National Museum of Damascus. For me, that would be the perfect place to start this kind of conversation, because in Syria, if you know the museum layout there, each region has its own local museum, and it carries, it holds, it displays the objects, the items, the history of that region. But Damascus Museum uniquely has items from all the regions of Syria, all of them. So in that museum would be the perfect hosting place for the national reconciliation of the people of Syria. That's what I hope for.
How realistic do you think that will be? And can you point to a model elsewhere in the world or the region that you think might be a sort of a pattern for Syria?
So in terms of realistic, I think we have a chance, okay? But at the same time, there's still a lot to be resolved. In terms of the current, now, today, there's, like I said, the east part of the country, east of the Euphrates, is still under SDF, which is the Kurdish-led coalition, which includes, by the way, Arabs and Christians and tribal elements and so on and so forth. But it's controlled by the Kurds. So when you say east of the Euphrates, you think of the Kurdish sort of governing council. When you think of the west coast, the northwest coastal region, you're going to think of the remnants of the regime. It's the heartland of the regime. That's where their strongholds are. And then you're going to think of the east part of the, what we call the Badie or the steppe areas. That's where the tribal regions are. And all of these have issues that have yet to be resolved in terms of how they're going to share power, who's going to get to say what. And they still retain a certain amount of their own control. The southern region, Damascus was taken by the southern front, what we call the south, which is the Horan-Dera front. Coming down from the north right now is Al-Jolani and the Hayat Tahrir Sham, HTS. All these guys are going to meet in Damascus at some point, and they're going to have to hash out all these differences. And we'll see what happens. But maybe I'm being a little too pessimistic, but I see a Libya-style kind of back and forth for the next 4 or 5 years. Not everybody would agree with me, but that would be my kind of, realistically speaking, I think there's a fair chance that this would be the model that we might see happening if they don't quickly resolve their issues. That said, The announcements made today all seem to give a positive light. They requested the current existing government and the Prime Minister to stay in his position and basically run the country whilst they prepare for the transition period. So I'm not too worried about what's going to happen in the next 24, 48 hours, even week, even maybe 4 weeks. I think once we start talking about transition, once we start talking about new constitution, once we start talking about those kind of things and the sharing of resources, that's when it's going to get a little more kind of sticky.
And what role should the international community play? I mean, some of these groups are prescribed terror organisations. How are we going to work this out?
Well, obviously, I remember the RA once upon a time being described and placed on just about everybody's terror list. And then we had the Irish quote-unquote deal. And lo and behold, they stopped being a terrorist organization. I remember the PLO once upon a time being prescribed as a terrorist organization, and then lo and behold, they stop. They come in. There are going to be certain prerequisites that they have to sort of announce, declare, etc. And based on that, there will be a rehabilitation period. And I think the Jolani is already, Madishara, I think his real name is. I think he's starting to use that more. That's a sign that he's no longer using his nom de guerre, Al-Jolani, or less and less. He announced, and again, just because he's saying these things doesn't mean they are actually going to happen, but the fact that these are signals that are coming out from his sort of quarter, saying that they are considering dissolving HTS once the conflict is done. They've asked, for example, local basically administrations to take over the administering of their towns and cities that they've taken. They've not tried to sort of rush in and grab it for themselves. These are all positive signals that we should build on. In terms of the other half of your question, what should we expect or what should we want from the international community and the region at large, I think two things were mentioned yesterday in a conversation. One, it's the immediate sort of support, what you might call humanitarian assistance, and getting the electricity up and running again, making sure that people have water, food, bread, that kind of stuff. And if they need shelter, obviously, getting that stuff going. But looking more long term, we need stabilization plans. We need post-conflict stabilization plans. And I personally strongly urge that we also need a reconciliation plan. Because post-conflict stabilization without reconciliation is not going to work. The regime, when it thought it had won the war, it went full triumphalist with terrible results. And the outcome is what we see today. I would warn against going triumphalist. And so far, I should stress again, so far I see none of that. But that's early days. We're literally not even 24 hours in. But in the last 10 days that we've seen things moving, I've seen no triumphalism. And that's a good thing. We've seen people celebrating. We've seen people cheering. We've seen people exhilarated. That's all normal. That's all fine. I'm one of the people who is celebrating. But triumphalism is something else. It's ugly. It's mean. And it will have long-term negative repercussions.
Amr Al-Azm, thank you very much indeed.
It's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Tobias Ellwood, former Member of Parliament and former Minister for the Middle East.
We've just come from a session on US MENA policy. Can you briefly summarise what was talked about for those who weren't at the session?
It does seem that things are moving so fast in this region, it's difficult to keep up. Each 24 hours, something else is happening. But the arrival of Donald Trump, of course, has got everybody asking what next for the United States, their engagement and so forth, their approach to Iran, what's going to happen with Gaza, Israel, all the treaties and the deals that are happening behind the scenes. What's clear is America is taking a step back from global intervention. There's an isolationism that is coming with Donald Trump. He's made that very, very clear. That's what his approach was when he was back in the White House, and it will continue today. So where things go from here, particularly with the fall of Syria, has a concern for all of us. I've seen American presidents come and go into the White House, and they all begin by saying, I'm going to look after the American citizens, I'm going to look after the homeland, and then getting drawn in to the wider melee, the challenges across the world, simply because a country as large as the United States that promotes democracy and the international rule of law can only but get engaged, because if America doesn't, then we see other alternatives with other states, authoritarian states with very different agendas, taking advantage of that vacuum. So I think it's inherent on countries like Britain, that has a close relationship with the United States, to look at solutions, provide that thought leadership, and engage with the United States to say, listen, let's all lean in and do our part to make the world safer, not least the Middle East.
You can say that Trump is not interventionist, but it was he that ended the JCPOA for better or for worse. And he's known as the great deal maker. Do you think there's going to be any movement on any kind of deal with Iran? Now Iran's on the back foot. Do you see his intervention playing any part in that sense?
Really interesting you mention Iran, because so often when we speak about the challenges in Gaza, Israel, the challenges in Lebanon and so forth, even the challenges in Syria, they all point to Iran. And Trump, I think, wasn't impressed with the JCPOA. It wasn't leading anywhere. Different reasons for that. But ultimately, Iran hadn't changed its stance. Its proxy influence across the world, across the Middle East, hadn't stopped. And therefore, that's resulted in maximum pressure, this phrase that he used to exert on Iran to change its behavior. I think the opportunity in the next Trump administration over a 4-year period is what happens when this Ayatollah dies. Because he's 85, I understand he's occasionally in a coma, he's not well. And whilst he's alive, nothing's going to happen. But when he dies, that is an opportunity, dare I say it, for a deal to be struck, to say, come on, we cannot continue just years and years of this, particularly now that Hezbollah, Iran, and so forth, even the Houthis and certainly Hamas, are not the fighting forces that they were before. And the Iranian people clearly want something very, very different indeed. If Trump can visit Kim Jong-un over in North Korea, then there's a potential that a deal could potentially be struck in connected with Iran as well.
Tobias Ellwood, thank you very much indeed.